Now, the Competition Commission has released the Essential Food Price Monitoring Report looking at the effects of COVID-19 on food markets and food pricing. The report found, among other things, that food prices had not returned to normal levels following the initial spike during the hard lockdown, with the pricing spread between wholesale and retail still higher than prior to the onset of the pandemic. Joining me now to talk about this is the Competition Commission Principal Economist, Jason Aprosky. Jason, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us on the Newsfeed Late Night.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So the Competition Commission's work on food price monitoring, what does it aim to do, and why did you actually embark on that exercise?
So I think when with the onset of the pandemic in March or February, March of this year, then the lockdown, which was instituted in March, we as the Commission started receiving a number of complaints from market players and from consumers around price movements and large price movements in the market. And so we focused our attention on food markets, given the importance of food, particularly for the consumption basket of poorer consumers, where it's a significant part. And we wanted to just monitor those prices, particularly over the following year, just for two reasons. One, to understand how COVID-19 and the initial lockdown was affecting pricing and the market dynamics, but also secondly, to see what that would reveal about how these markets work longer term and the competition dynamics within these markets. And I think that's the sort of basis for the monitoring work that we've done, which has produced some interesting conclusions so far.
Yeah, it's the third report of its kind that you are producing. Let's stay with the first two first. What were the features of that? I know you had focused on the fresh produce sector. What did it reveal about the pricing dynamics?
Yeah, so I think what we observed quite clearly, particularly initially with the first level of lockdown or the initial lockdown, was quite clear pricing impacts both in wholesale markets and in retail markets. So we've really attributed this to kind of a panic buying behavior, stockpiling, those kind of consumption patterns. But we did see impacts both in wholesale and retail. Particularly around the most essential food products, so your top vegetables, potatoes, carrots, onions, those kind of products, but also other products we've seen that are also considered essential, like your dairy and your meat and some of your grains. So we saw those impacts initially in both markets, but as we moved through March, April into May, what we observed is that some of those wholesale prices or the wholesale market started to stabilize. So they started to return to some kind of normality, if you know what looked like at least normality. But what we observed in the second report is just in the retail markets, those kind of effects or the pricing impacts, while they did lessen, they weren't going back to sort of pre-COVID levels. So there was this concern that you have a wholesale retail margin which is persistently higher than before the onset of the pandemic and the lockdowns that came with it.
Yeah, let's look at that in real terms. Pricing outcomes for the dairy markets. You're saying here the producer price of raw milk has gone up by just under 2 rand per litre, from 3 rand 20 cents per litre in January 2012 to 5 rand 13 cents per litre in September of 2020. Whereas the retail price has increased by over 6 rands per litre, from 8 rand 35 cents per litre to 14 rand 73 cents per litre. That's a huge jump, in other instances by almost 10 rand. What does that evidence tell us about what's happening?
Yeah, so the milk market has seen some complaints from particular farmers, producers over time, but also other players in the industry. And towards the beginning of lockdown, we got quite a few complaints from farmers who are complaining about being squeezed. So they're seeing their profits drop and their sustainability being impacted. So what our report really shows is that over the long term, what we've seen and what other market players have observed is that the gap between the farmer's price and the retail price is getting smaller and smaller. So what that means is almost there's less margin in the market. So the farmers are getting, in effect, as a proportion of the ultimate retail price, are getting less for their milk. And this is a sort of a trend over the longer term. And what the sort of working hypothesis there was this was processors who were taking a larger portion of the margin. But what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, where we have a bit more detailed data, we can separate the margin between retailers and processors, is that actually you find firstly, that processors have remained, the margin available to processors has been relatively constant. And when you look at the prices farmers are getting, those are also relatively constant, if not falling at certain points in the last sort of year and a half, 2 years. But what you do find in the last couple of years is that retailers are beginning to pick up margin on milk, on dairy products, which we haven't really seen before in the past. As far as we know, the way that milk is used to draw people into the shops. But in the last year, we've seen retail margins increase. So they're really driving this increase in margin. And then we've also seen that over particularly the COVID period, the initial lockdown period, we saw quite a sharp increase in margins, which is also attributed to the retailers, as far as we can see.
So the retailers, in a sense, are eating up their own margins, but they're also eating up the margins of the farmers as well. What are the drivers? Just pure greed?
Look, it's difficult to tell. What we have observed across a number of markets, and milk as well, is that there has been a change in consumption patterns from the onset of the pandemic and the lockdown. So what we find is a lot more panic buying behavior, but we're also finding a switch from, because of the lockdown, a switch from off-site consumption, restaurants, etc., to in-home cooking. And that is a switch in demand which has benefited retailers as demand at local retailer grows because more people are buying food to cook themselves at home, or to essentially feed themselves. So there is a jump in demand from both panic buying and also this switch in consumption patterns. And what we've observed more broadly over the longer term in other food markets is that where you find costs increasing for retailers, so the wholesale prices are going up, retail prices are quite quick to respond. But where wholesale prices or the input costs are coming down, your retail prices aren't as quick to respond. They take longer to come and meet those the decrease in input costs that they're facing. So whether this is some kind of market structure issue or market power issue or the way the market works, it's something that we're considering further and looking into it. But it does suggest that the market is perhaps not as efficient as it could be.
So one would say, do you have a tool to force the retailers to drop prices, or at least for them to stabilize?
Yeah, so there are a few tools at our disposal. We haven't got to a formal investigation yet, but essentially the first tool would be a formal investigation to get better information from the retailers and understand exactly what's happened and why. And then we'd go from there. But at the moment, it's exploratory, it's monitoring. Where this goes from here, a decision hasn't been made yet.
Jason, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us. The Competition Commission Principal Economist, Jason Abrowski.